Hello, and welcome to the third episode of our Lakes Chat Summer Series. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Vice President of Communications and Engagement here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Today, we're talking about invasive carp. These harmful fish have been a looming threat for years, steadily moving up Illinois waterways towards Lake Michigan. At the same time, the federal government and Great Lakes states have been debating options for preventing them from getting into the lakes. Joining me today is my colleague Annalisa Castle, the Alliance's Water Policy Manager, and she leads our campaign to keep these invasive carp out of the Great Lakes. Welcome, Annalisa. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jen. Good to be here.
So I know many of our listeners have been following this issue for years, but to bring everyone up to speed, give us a quick overview. What are invasive carp and why should we be worried?
Sure. So there were actually four types of invasive carp that were originally imported deliberately in the 1970s for aquaculture purposes, but through flooding and accidental release, these fish have made it into the Mississippi River system. And two types of carp are found in the Illinois waterway, silver and bighead carp, and they're these populations are now within striking distance of Lake Michigan. And the reason that we need to be worried about these fish is that they outcompete native fish. In some places in the Illinois River, they make up 90% of the biomass. They can eat, up to a third of their weight, which can be 20 to 40 pounds, or even up to 100 in some cases. These are big fish that pose serious threats to our ecosystem. And in the Great Lakes, that means a $7 billion a year fishing industry. It means a $16 billion a year recreational industry. And so the impacts of an infestation of Asian carp could be quite devastating.
And they pose a threat not just ecologically, but also to like recreational boaters, right? Don't some of the fish like jump out of the water? I know we've all seen the sort of silly videos, but that's a pretty serious threat. That's a really huge fish to jump at you, right?
Yeah, it can be a safety issue when you have these huge fish jumping, in some cases hitting boaters, but it's also just extremely unpleasant. And when you think about the Great Lakes region and how many sort of mom and pop shops and tourism based local economies could suffer from, if people no longer wanted to go to beaches or out on the water, there's huge economic impact too.
Yeah, it would certainly deter me from going out for a day of boating on the Great Lakes, that's for sure. So the population of invasive carp, like sort of what the researchers call the leading edge, is only about 50 miles from Chicago and Lake Michigan. And I know that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, through a giant, lengthy study process, has identified a location, the Brandon Road Lock and Dam near Joliet, Illinois, which is south of Chicago, as the best place to build some structures to keep these fish from moving toward Chicago and Lake Michigan. So tell us a little bit about what they're planning to build there. And the big question, do we think it'll work?
Great question. Well, like you said, the Army Corps of Engineers did a lengthy study and looked at several potential technologies to stop the movement of invasive carp. And Joliet, the Brandon Road Lock and Dam, was identified as sort of a choke point to prevent these invasive fish from making it into the Chicago area waterway system, where they could wreak havoc that we just talked about. And so that's the location. And then the proposed project is really a suite of different technologies that sort of represent the cutting edge in terms of deterrence. And that will include an air bubble curtain. It will include an engineered channel for the boats to prevent entrainment of fish coming through with barges and other river traffic. It'll include an electric barrier, a flushing lock, and boat launches, all designed to stop the movement of these fish past this really critical choke point.
I heard somebody describe it once as an invasive carp gauntlet, right? So that hopefully if they make it through one, they won't make it through the next. So it sounds like this is a series of options to increasingly deter these fish from getting past that lock and dam.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So I know that there's a hefty price tag for this project. It's not cheap. But it's my understanding that Illinois, Michigan, and some of the other Great Lakes states have sort of rallied behind this issue. Obviously, the other Great Lakes states are concerned about these fish getting into their waters. So, what's the status of getting all of this stuff built at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam? And more importantly, how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So I think one of the first things I like to note is that the price tag that has sort of made headlines is inclusive of a pretty massive contingency budget. And we won't really have an accurate picture of what the final project will cost until we get through what is called pre-construction engineering and design. So like we just talked about, the Corps has identified all these technologies, but the whole project is only about 5% designed. And so some really positive developments have happened recently. We have entered into that pre-construction engineering and design phase. We call it PED because it's such an attractive phrasing and acronym for this. But the PED phase will tell us a lot more about the final project. And another really exciting thing that happened is in late 2020, Congress passed the Water Resources Development Act, which authorized the construction of Brandon Road and adjusted the cost share so that the federal government share of costs is now at 80% and 20% being the local share. That's up from 65-35, which is typical. And on the local side, that cost is really shared across Illinois, and Michigan has invested even in this initial design phase. And our goal now with having moved into PED, having achieved that cost share, is also to make sure that Congress, House, and Senate Energy and Water Appropriations subcommittees include funding for the Brandon Road PED project, as was requested in the president's budget. And so if we can get through some of these sort of upcoming hurdles, we're going to be in a good position to move through that design phase and really get down to sort of the nuts and bolts of the project.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's been a big effort at the federal level to realize by Great Lakes states to recognize that this isn't just an Illinois issue. This is something that could impact all Great Lakes states, which kind of makes that argument for why the federal government should step up and pay a little bit more. But there still is some local costs, and Michigan is pitching in some dollars too, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, even just for this PED phase, it's going to cost nearly $30 million over the next 3 to 4 years. And the sort of non-federal or the state side or portion of that is about 10 million. And Michigan came to the table with 8. So that's awesome. And we know from sort of past conversations, as we've talked about this being a lengthy process, that several of our neighboring states are also really invested in getting protections in place for the Great Lakes. And so in addition to getting through the pre-construction engineering and design phase, we're also going to have to keep up that drumbeat, be in communication with our neighbors, and make sure that we're moving towards sort of construction of this project in a way that is collaborative.
Yeah. Well, that's great to see Great Lakes states coming together like that. And kudos to Illinois and Michigan for helping to push this project along. So obviously we don't have a final price tag yet for this Brandon Road project, but it's not going to be cheap. It's the short version. And we've heard some criticism over the years of people pushing back and saying, like, look, don't worry about building all this stuff. Just fish out all the fish, right? And make a market so that we could sell them for something. And there have been all kinds of proposals, right? That we could sell them for to use as protein source in pet food, or marketing them as a delicacy in high-end restaurants. There have been all these ideas. So help us understand what the deal is here. Like, is it really an option to just fish all the fish out of the waterways in Illinois? Is that really a viable pathway to making sure they don't get to Lake Michigan?
I mean, the short answer is no. I can't tell you how many fundraisers I've been where we've had Asian carp burger, like sliders, and I'll tell you, like, you can make a beautiful meal, I'm sure, out of these fish. But at the end of the day, creating a market for an invasive species is it can't be the answer to everything. The sheer volume of these fish is overwhelming, And I think that fishing and monitoring have to be part of sort of the approach that we take to controlling what is a really serious ecological threat. But we need structural solutions in place as well. And I just, I think if we can create jobs, if we can learn something from the fishing and monitoring practice, like that is worthwhile and that is important. But I think keeping our eye on sort of the big picture, sort of systemic solution is going to be critical, because these things take real persistence.
Yeah. And these fish are persistent, they're not just sitting there by themselves like, hey, catch me. And it would take a lot of fish in restaurants to use up all of the Asian carp, or invasive carp rather, in all of our waterways. There's a lot out there. So I know that we've heard a little bit, and the state of Illinois has kind of teased a big effort. They're going to announce next week a rebranding of invasive carp. And we've seen this with other fish species. You give them a fancier name, it makes them seem a bit more palatable. What do you know about this effort, and what do you think about it?
I don't know much. I think they've kept it under wraps. I'm really looking forward to learning more about the rebrand. I know that significant resources have been put into this project, and I think I'm excited to see sort of what sort of value this adds to the conversation. I've caught myself now calling these fish by sort of an outmoded name, and I should be sort of like practicing invasive carp more. And so I'm a little bit, I just want to name that. And I also think that if I'm having this problem, other people will have this problem. And I think the kind of energy and resources it takes to make a rebrand stick, that is another question of like, where do we allocate resources to address this problem? And I don't know that I have a clear position on that, but it's something to think about if that's the role of, for example, the Department of Natural Resources. And at the same time, like I said, I think this can be part of the way that we approach this collectively. And I think it is such a massive problem for our Illinois waterways and threat to our Great Lakes that I'm glad to see that folks are getting creative and investing in sort of a suite of options. But it's that same thing of keeping our eyes on the prize and understanding that we need to advance structural solutions, and everything else, can be a part of awareness raising for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like we just really need an all hands on deck approach. We need to keep up the fishing, and there is some of that going on to control the populations, build the new stuff at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam facility, keep up all of the monitoring that happens to make sure that those fish aren't sneaking up our way towards Lake Michigan. So it sounds like we really need everything to make sure we protect the Great Lakes. Yeah. So in just a minute or two that we have left, what can our listeners do to get involved, right? This seems like a huge issue. I can't get out my shovel and head down to Joliet to start building something at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam. But what are next steps, and how can our listeners get involved?
Great question. So I think one thing that I mentioned, right, is that there is an ongoing effort to make sure that Senate and House Energy and Water subcommittees appropriate the money that we need to pay for the design phase. So hearing from constituents is one of the most important ways that elected officials keep these things top of mind. There is a big to-do list in Washington, and so using your voice is really important. We do have an action alert, I believe, that folks can go and to our website, with a couple of clicks and maybe a zip code, be able to send off their letters to members of Congress, making sure this is top of mind. And I think there may be future opportunities to do something similar. And aside from that, I do think that making sure you're keeping an eye out, like whether whatever sort of splash this rebrand makes, like take a minute to read the article, bring a critical eye to it. We've seen a lot of developments with these fish over the past several years, whether it's bad things like environmental DNA or juvenile fish being found close to Lake Michigan past the existing sort of barriers, or really positive developments like the Water Resources Development Act passing in a way that makes it possible to move forward with these structural measures. And so staying in touch about these issues, we're committed to helping you do that. Our website has usually got a pretty good up-to-date sort of set of blogs and statements and updates and action alerts. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
Yeah, certainly this has been one of those issues we've talked about at the Alliance for well over a decade now. And it's just going to take time to make sure, keep the pressure on Congress, keep the pressure on our federal agencies in the states to really make progress and get those new structures built at the Brandon Road facility. So we really know that we're keeping those carp out. And there are those scares along the way, right? They found some fish close to Lake Michigan. Fortunately, it was sort of an errant one-off that managed to get through. But being really vigilant is super important. And I see that my colleague, Michelle, who's working with us behind the scenes, has dropped a link in the chat for that. And you can also find more at greatlakes.org/takeaction to get involved. So, Annalisa, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that there is so much more to talk about, but we are running up on our time limit here. Also, big thanks to Michelle Farley, my colleague that you don't see on screen, but she's behind the scenes making all of this happen. And thank you, Michelle. Make sure that you join us next Tuesday, June 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern, noon Central for our next episode. We'll be talking about plastic pollution in the Great Lakes and how you can help. Thanks so much and see you next time.
Thank you.